Here are some general things I would switch in Guild Wars 2 currently. First off, while I think Warhorn is actually quite useful and has shown up in many metas, I would make the cast time of both of these skills 1/3 of a second as opposed to 1/2 of a second. The reason for this is this struggles a bit under pressure. So having both of these skills casted at 1/3 the time would actually really help. It would help players who need to use this under pressure, especially in PvP and Worldy World. Animation for throw bolas is very sluggish, especially the pre-cast. That needs to be speeded up because no one ever has used this skill because it's always been way too slow to use. The same thing with Stomp, actually. Stomp is too slow and gimmicky to use effectively. There's this weird precast animation that's going on that makes it slow in the beginning. Same with throw bolas. This needs to be speeded up. Another option for Stomp would be just to make this have evade frames in it. You can even reduce the amount of stab it would give you, like initial stab, but you would have evade frames. That would just make it kind of a more finessed quality of life change that would help out. On stance and Doliac Signet should have their baseline cooldowns reduced by at least 5 seconds. Banner of Tactics should have a real break stun. It needs to actually break the stun. Right now, when you cast it, it only breaks the stun after you casted it. That's ridiculous. I don't understand the logic there. That doesn't make any sense. You'll very rarely need to break a stun while the banner is already casted. There's only like 0.2 milliseconds of that time for that window to be open for a break stun to even be possible. That's just ridiculous. This is just very confusing and misleading. It needs to be an actual break stun so that when you cast Banner of Tactics, it breaks the stun. You can reduce the amount of stab stacks from 5 to 3, or even 2 if you really want to be aggressive, but the break stun here is very misleading. General banners are still not great. They need more love. They need more quality of life stuff going on with them. They've just been in a rough spot, and yeah, I would prefer banners having some sort of thing where you could cast the banner and then have another ability on your hotbar so that you could use that ability while the banner is casted. That would be another solution to the finicky, gimmicky banner problem. Another thing is Berserker Stance. This skill used to be usable, but now is not. By the way, all of these changes it's a PvP oriented change list, but honestly, these changes could be true for any game mode. Berserker Stance. The cooldown for this is outrageous, especially considering that after the resistance nerf and the CC condies are the only thing that resistance affects as opposed to the damaging condies, this skill is dead. I mean, it's basically just a bad trait. It's a bad skill and it hasn't been touched in forever. I don't know why this hasn't been touched. Something needs to be done with it. Either they reduce the cooldown of it to 20 seconds, or they add in resolution on Berserker Stance so that it actually is effective against damaging condies. And or you do both of them at the same time. You make it give you resistance and adrenaline and also resolution while also having a lower cooldown. It doesn't need to be 20 seconds. I just said 20 seconds because I'm figuring they won't add resolution. But if you did add resolution, it could be like 30 seconds or 25 seconds. The cooldown is too long. This should be at least 55 seconds, probably 50, but yeah, you could at least start with 55, honestly. Frenzy is better. It used to be 45 seconds. It's still not good enough, though. No one is using it, at least in PvP. And I would definitely think that it's not being used enough in other game modes as well. I would reduce this cooldown by at least another 5 seconds. And I would also increase the quickness from 4 seconds to 5 seconds baseline, and the might from 6 seconds to 7 seconds baseline. Honestly, I think you could even go for a 30-second cooldown, but if you want to be safe, you could try 35 at first. Featherfoot Grace recently got few buffs to its cooldown. It used to be a 40 or some atrocious number like 45 seconds. Now it's a 30-second cooldown, which is strange because they actually like went to this skill and addressed it while Berserker Stance is just sitting here dead and it's just not being addressed at all. Like what? Like they should talk about Berserker Stance. It's just sitting there. It's not being touched. But anyway, it was, Featherfoot Grace, it got its cooldown reduction buffed, and now it's 30 seconds, but it's competing with a better skill called Shake It Off. This skill breaks stuns, and it's an AoE break stun, and it removes Condi. And because resistance is not good against damaging Condi, then what's the point? It's just it's less bang for your buck. So in order to compete with Shake It Off, one of two things needs to happen. Either they add resolution to the skill so it helps against damaging Condis, or they reduce the cooldown from 30 seconds to 25 seconds break stun so that way it can actually compete with Shake It Off. You could have a little bit better cooldown reduction so you could break stuns a little bit more, but in my opinion, it still would not be as good as Shake It Off. I'm just saying either one of those things would help. You could also just combine both of them. Honestly, if you just added resolution to Featherfoot Grace, 5 seconds of resolution and a 25-second cooldown, in my opinion, that's not terrible. It's not OP. I mean, that would still compete with Shake It Off. This is an AoE break stun, and it removes Condi, for Condi. So, i.e., in other words, Featherfoot Grace needs a buff. Free animation for sword is way too slow. It doesn't do anything. There's a few ways you could address this. You could just make the baseline damage of Flurry better, so that if you want to go more power variant, it would be better. But it seems that Sword has this theme of Condi. If that's what you want to do, then you should at least make Flurry have a much faster baseline speed. I mean, literally like 50% faster. Like the speed you get with Frenzy using it is what it should be. It should be 50%. So Final Thrust has the same sort of animation issue where the precast, or I don't know if it's the precast honestly, but either the precast or the initial time of the beginning of the animation is very slow and sluggish. It's a minor gripe. They don't need to address it if they don't want to. But in my opinion, that slow cast in the very beginning of that animation is a little bit too slow. You compare this with Disrupting Stab, that animation is very fast. Now, granted, this damage is not as much, but it's still a daze and is very useful on Spellbreaker. And when we look at the damage here, it is more damage and it does apply bleeding, but still this animation is a little bit too slow in the beginning. A minor gripe again, but something worth considering. Cognitive Rage should give more passive adrenaline. I don't know why this trait or the skill got nerfed the way it did all those years ago, but whatever. The passive adrenaline for Signet of Rage is not enough. Also, at the very least, giving the might duration more time. It should be 8 seconds might for 20 seconds of might for 8 seconds. 8 seconds of fury and 8 seconds of swiftness. That alone would help. The adrenaline is only 2 every 3 seconds. That's not enough. It should be 3 adrenaline or 4 adrenaline every 3 seconds, or 2 adrenaline every 2 seconds. Basically, just speeding up the amount of adrenaline and giving it a little bit more adrenaline because right now it's not enough unless maybe you're an SB, in which case, who cares anyway because you're going to go rampage. Healing Signet passivity. This got nerfed into oblivion many years ago, and it's never recovered. I believe there's like a passive heal that another class says, maybe it's Revenant, I don't remember, that has literally this, but it's just better. It's just a better passive signet heal, essentially, and it's just passively healing for more. The heal passivity here is not enough. This needs to be better passively. A way to make Mace more useful, in my opinion, is to make the 5 skill Tremor have a shockwave that spreads out as it goes further along its path. Right now, its speed is not bad and it does a good job, but it's kind of a narrow cast on the floor. And if you see, it only ripples in a small area. If it spread out more as it traveled along the path, it would have more of a chance to hit the target if it was further away and thus be more useful at range, which is the whole point of Tremor. Pistol feels mostly good for Bladesworn, in my opinion. I think that the only small gripe I would make for it is that the range of the 5 skill, Dragon's Roar, is a little bit too close. I would make this maybe 260 or 250 at least, as opposed to 240. Considering the knockback is pretty pervasive, I would make sure that at least it's in range of the target you're trying to fire at. Let's talk about some of the traits. To start off, right now in the meta, Hammer is a bit too pervasive for Spellbreaker. I'm sure that'll be nerfed. But for the future, to encourage strength Spellbreakers to be more of a thing, I would implore buffing. Might makes right, healing per stack of might from 85 to 100, at the very, very least, 95. But in my opinion, it should be 100. Brave Stride should have the stability go up from 2 seconds with a 10-second cooldown to 3 seconds with a 10-second cooldown at the very least to make this compete with Restorative Strength and Peak Performance. Body Blow in general is an awkward trait. I would just encourage buffing it in some sort of way. Berserker's Power needs to proc on use, so that when you use a burst skill, it actually procs as you're bursting, and you can burst with the benefit of the damage output. You don't get the damage output increase after the burst, you get it while you're bursting and after. That's a small, in my opinion, buff that's also a quality of life buff. Banner trait, Double Standards, should be flipped with Warrior's Cunning. This is just my opinion, but I feel like putting Double Standards into Tactics and flipping Warrior's Cunning into Discipline would make it to where Bladesworn can use Double Standards with the Tactics trait line without needing to go Discipline, because as we all know, Bladesworns don't really go into Discipline when they use their profession or their spec. They always or most of the time are using Tactics. This is important because Bladesworn usually likes to go for more supportive options. It's a hybrid support. So having Double Standards where Warrior's Cunning is and flipping Warrior's Cunning to where Double Standards is would make it to where Bladesworns want to use Double Standards in the Tactics trait line so that they can actually res people while they're playing Bladesworn. Arms need a lot of work. While this trait is probably the best trait in Arms, Signet Mastery should probably, honestly, be a Grandmaster trait, but that's just a small gripe. In reality, though, dual wielding, in my opinion, is not worth it. It's not ever worth taking. Even if you go into Arms, it's still not worth taking. Either the attack speed should go up by 10%, 30% while you're wielding the main hand weapon in your offhand, or the perk of the attack speed increase of having the 20% speed increase while you have a main hand and your offhand should just be across the board, even when you're wielding your other weapon kit, which is not offhand in the main hand or main hand on the offhand weapon. It would still give you the 20% damage increase or speed increase, sorry. That way, this would have more usability. Right now, it's just not usable enough. If you wanted to play it safe, just giving this a 10% attack speed increase from 20 to 30% would make this more viable. Burst precision should have a buff to where not only do your burst skills always crit, but for a few seconds afterward, every attack will crit for at least 1 or 2 seconds after. That way, you can crit with your burst always, and then for a second or 2 seconds after, depending on how strong it is, you can crit afterwards. This would help buff this skill to where arms would seem more viable. This would be good, especially for something like a Bladesworn, who might want to go into a different amulet or stat line like Valkyrie. Valkyrie has good vitality, ferocity, and power, but it doesn't have any precision. It helps with the HP pool, but that way you would have your precision by going arms, going burst precision, and voila, you can now go Valkyrie. But right now, even if you do this, it's still not worth it. This is why burst precision should be buffed. Bloodlust, minor trait, is very peculiar and will not be that useful. In general, it needs a buff at least from 33% on crit to inflict bleeding to at least 66%. Probably more, but that would at least be a start. Shrug it off trait in the tactics line, while it's okay, still honestly is not quite worth it. Having this remove 2 or 3 condies when it's procced as opposed to just one would make this a little bit better and more viable compared to Empower Allies. Back to Bladesworn. This cooldown is 15 seconds currently, giving you protection when you enter Dragon Trigger. It should be 8 seconds. Why? Because that's how long it takes for you to go back into Dragon Trigger, and it only procs every other time you enter Dragon Trigger, not every time. That's just strange and misleading, and it doesn't really work. It seems to be a leftover from when you had stability on a 15-second cooldown when you entered Dragon Trigger, and now it's protection, but they didn't really go the full 9 yards with that change, and now you only get protection every other time you enter Dragon Trigger. It should be 8-second cooldown, not 15. Also, in my opinion, 3 seconds is not even enough. It should be 4 seconds or 5 seconds so that way it's justifiable for you to enter that vulnerable state of charging up your Dragon Trigger. Flicker Step, in my opinion, should have a range of 350. That's just me, but I think that it's not quite large enough of a leap for it to be super useful. Either doing that or adding an additional ammo count from 2 to 3. Electric Fence all around got a rework a while ago, but it's still not quite useful enough because, let's be honest, it's too clumsy to use this skill in a lot of the game modes. In my opinion, Electric Fence should be an aura. It should literally just be some sort of magnetic aura that gives you mag aura and follows you wherever you go, as opposed to you having to drop it and sit behind it. That's too awkward. Flow Stabilizer is also underpowered. In the beta, this gave you stability, and they nerfed it, and now it only gives you fury with the flow rate that's also given to you. In my opinion, this is not worth it. They should give you at least some might on top of the fury or some other boon to justify using this compared to something like, say, for Great Justice, which has fury and might. Why not just use this? That's my point. This should be buffed in some way, probably just by giving it might. Tactical reload, in addition to everything else it does, in my opinion, it should also reset your dragon trigger. So if you have your dragon trigger on cooldown while you use tactical reload, it'll automatically reset the dragon trigger for you to use. It's technically a buff, but in my opinion, it's really just more of a quality of life change. While in Berserk stance, your passive adrenaline should be more than what it currently is, which is 0. You don't get any passive adrenaline anymore when you're in Berserk mode, and it feels like even with the adrenaline that's granted to you, it's not enough. You never feel like you have quite enough adrenaline. While you're in Berserk mode, the theme should be you're a raging, crazy Berserk person, and you are getting a little bit of passive adrenaline, maybe as much as the reconfigured Signet of Rage. That's like about 3 adrenaline every 2 or 3 seconds. Sundering Leap should give a daze or a stun when you use it. Right now, it did get a recent buff that no one really noticed, but they didn't really notice it because it's not at all enough of a buff. It's only 1300 and applies some vulnerability and cripple compared to something like Bull's Charge. It's just not worth it, especially in PvP and World v World. So really, this should apply a small daze or some sort of soft CC effect to where this is better. The baseline heal for Defiant Stance. While this skill is not terrible, most people prefer mending over it because it's more of a guaranteed heal. The way to help this, in my opinion, as opposed to just nerfing mending, which I do not recommend, I think mending's fine, is to make Defiant Stance have a small increase to its baseline heal from 1853 to, say, 19 or 20. To the limit is usually not taken in some game modes because if you're playing Bladesworn, its heal skill seems to be better, and if you're not playing Bladesworn, then mending is always the preferred choice. The way to alleviate this, in my opinion, would be honestly just giving vigor on top of its already applied effects, or just reducing the cooldown from 30 seconds to 25 or 28. Offhand Axe leaves you super vulnerable when you use the 5 skill. While it's a very fun skill, and it's very good as far as doing damage, it's very it leads the player to being extremely vulnerable, which has always outweighed the pros for using this skill. This skill should not leave you this insanely vulnerable. In my opinion, this skill should have one change that would make it more useful, which is the movement speed increase. Right now it's 50%. I would honestly give super speed on Whirling Axe. Take away the movement speed increase and give the player super speed, which is a 100% increase. That way, if you use the skill with super speed baked into it, you can then move a little bit faster, as I was saying earlier, and have a little bit super speed perhaps after the skill so that you have a follow-up to keep engaging with your attacks. Another change to Whirling Axe that I recommend is making it negate projectiles. Projectiles should not be able to inflict an insane amount of damage while you're using the skill at range. And if that turns out to be too strong, then baking in Featherfoot Grace would be enough. Imminent Threat. No one ever uses this skill because it's just not good. Making the radius of this better than 240, I would recommend 300 at least, or probably 350 would make this more viable. Fight Beyond Sight is a bad skill, and it needs a buff. I would recommend giving this resistance as on top of what it already has, and even an extra charge so that you could use this 3 times with an ammo counter as opposed to just 2. Kick is never taken. It's a meme skill. I recommend doing something to this. I mean, you could give a small fraction of stability while using this or something to where this is actually considered at all. Well, it's not the case in PvE and World v World. In PvP, Winds of Disenchantment are terrible and are never taken. Addressing this in some way, like making Winds of Disenchantment follow you after you cast it and making the duration of the skill last longer, would help. Shield Master, while this trait is not bad, it's definitely usable. In my opinion, the amount of adrenaline it gives you per hit on your block is not quite enough. Having it be 2 adrenaline as opposed to 1 would be a good change. The 5 skill, Blade Storm on offhand dagger, doesn't do nearly enough damage. Also, while applying swiftness is always nice, honestly, it's not at all worth it. There should just be something else going on here. In my opinion, it should be super speed. Last but not least, the dreaded rifle. Rifle butt's good, but the casting animation for this takes forever. The casting animation for the 4 skill, Brutal Shot, took way too long, as you could just see. In the heat of combat, that is a long time just to do what the character is doing. Explosive Shell, again, has a very long, sluggish animation cast time. I don't know what is with the pre-casting of all these animations, but they're sluggish, and it makes this weapon kit feel way too awkward and slow. Basically, cleaning up the pre-cast times and the animations of these skills would really benefit it to make it not as bad.